The story does not begin with numbers. It begins with silence, a factory floor once alive with rhythm, precision, and mechanical harmony now echoes with something unfamiliar. Not chaos, not destruction, but absence. The kind of absence that feels temporary at first, until it isn't. Machines stand perfectly still, not because they're broken, but because they're waiting for orders that are slower to arrive, waiting for a demand that once felt infinite and now feels uncertain. Nothing looks wrong, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Because this was never supposed to happen. There was a time when this economy was not just strong, it was inevitable. It wasn't just the engine of Europe. It was the blueprint, the model, the standard by which industrial power was measured. Precision, discipline, efficiency. These weren't just qualities, they were identity. And for decades that identity worked flawlessly. Growth was steady, output was dominant, stability was unquestioned. While other economies fluctuated, experimented, and sometimes stumbled, this one remained consistent, predictable, reliable, unshakable. But systems that appear unshakable often carry hidden cost. They stop questioning themselves, they stop adapting, and slowly, they begin to assume the world will continue to behave the way it always has. That assumption is where the story begins to fracture. A high-speed train moves across the landscape engineered with perfection, designed for precision timing. It was once a symbol of something greater than transportation. It represented trust, reliability, forward momentum without hesitation. Today, it is delayed, not once, not occasionally, but often enough that the delay no longer surprises anyone. At first, it feels like a minor inconvenience, a technical issue, a logistical flaw. But systems do not collapse through single failures. They reveal themselves through patterns, small inconsistencies, minor disruptions, repeated delays, signals that something deeper is changing, because the train is not just a train, it is a reflection of a system that is still moving, but no longer leading, still functioning, but no longer flawless, still stable, but no longer dominant. And here's where the paradox begins to emerge. How can one of the strongest economies in the world begin to slow down? Without anyone sounding the alarm, there is no dramatic crash, no sudden collapse, no moment where everything breaks. On paper, everything still works. Growth exists, institutions function, industry continues. But beneath that surface, something is shifting. Quietly, subtly, relentlessly. Because the most dangerous form of decline is not the kind you can see, it's the kind you can't. The kind that hides inside stability, the kind that disguises itself as normal. This is not a story of failure, it is a story of transformation. A transformation so gradual, it almost feels invisible. And yet, its consequences may be irreversible. Somewhere within this system, within its design, its structure, its philosophy, 3 decisions were made, not reckless decisions, were logical, strategic, even necessary at the time. But over time, those decisions became constraints, limits, and eventually, liabilities. These are the 3 fatal mistakes. Not because they were wrong, but because the world changed and the system did not change fast enough. This is the hidden tension at the center of everything. Strength, when pushed to its extreme, becomes rigidity. Efficiency, when perfected, eliminates flexibility. Stability, when prioritized above all else, resists disruption even when disruption is necessary for survival. In other words, the very qualities that built this economic powerhouse may now be the same forces slowly pulling it apart. And this is where the story becomes unsettling, because it challenges something deeper than economics. It challenges our assumptions about strength itself. We tend to believe that the stronger a system becomes, the more resilient it is. But what if the opposite is true? What if strength, beyond a certain point, becomes a trap? A system so optimized for one version of the world that it cannot adapt when that world changes, and the world has changed faster than expected, in ways that are not immediately visible, but deeply structural. Global dynamics are shifting. Energy systems are evolving. Demographics are transforming. Innovation is accelerating in unpredictable directions. And within all of this, the system continues to operate as if the rules are still the same, but they aren't. And that's where the real risk begins, because systems don't collapse the moment they become outdated. They continue, they function, they survive, but they do so with increasing friction, increasing inefficiency, increasing vulnerability, until one day, the gap between what the system was designed for and what the world demands becomes too large to ignore, and by then, it's already too late to fix it. So here's the question that lingers beneath everything you've seen so far. What if this isn't a temporary slowdown? What if it's the early stage of something much larger, something structural, something irreversible? Because to understand how something breaks, you don't start at the moment of collapse, you start at the moment of design, because the seeds of failure are almost always planted at the same time as the seeds of success. And to see them, you have to go back to the beginning, because to understand how this system is slowly coming apart, you first have to understand how it was built. To understand what is happening now, you have to go back to a time when nothing existed, not metaphorically, literally, an economy reduced to fragments. Cities turned into shadows of what they once were. Infrastructure erased. Industry gone. It was not just collapse, it was a reset. And in that moment of complete destruction, something unusual happened. Instead of chaos, there was clarity instead of improvisation. There was intention. This was not a recovery driven by chance. It was a reconstruction driven by design. Every decision that followed was shaped by one central idea. Never again. Never again, unpredictability. Never again, vulnerability to forces that could not be controlled. And so, the foundation was laid not just for growth, but for control. Control through discipline, control through structure, control through precision. The system that emerged was not organic. It was engineered. Manufacturing became its backbone, not because it was easy, but because it was controllable. Industrial production offered something rare in a chaotic world. Predictability. Inputs could be measured. Outputs could be optimized. Processes could be refined. Everything could be improved, incrementally, relentlessly. And over time, this obsession with precision became something more. It became identity. Products weren't just produced, they were perfected. Systems weren't just built, they were optimized. Efficiency wasn't just a goal, it was a philosophy. And the world noticed, demand grew. Exports surged. The system began to expand beyond its borders, quietly embedding itself into global markets. This wasn't just economic growth, it was economic dominance built, not on speed, but on reliability. While other nations experimented, diversified, and took risks, this system doubled down on what it knew worked: consistency, predictability, control, and for decades, this approach seemed almost invincible because it aligned perfectly with the world. At the time, global trade was expanding. Demand was stable. Energy was accessible. Markets were predictable enough to reward long-term planning. It was the perfect environment for a system designed to eliminate uncertainty. And so, the machine grew stronger, more efficient, more precise, more dominant. But here's where the paradox quietly begins to form. Because every system that optimizes for one outcome sacrifices another. In this case, the system optimized for efficiency, which meant, over time, it began to lose something less visible. But far more important: flexibility, adaptability, the ability to change. At first, this wasn't a problem. In fact, it was an advantage. Why change something that works perfectly? Why introduce uncertainty into a system built to eliminate it? And so, the structure became more rigid, not intentionally, but inevitably. Processes became standardized. Systems became institutionalized. Success became expected. And expectation is where evolution begins to slow, because when something works consistently, the incentive to question it disappears. The system stopped evolving not because it failed to innovate, but because it had already found a formula that seemed to work indefinitely. But here's the uncomfortable truth. No formula works forever, because the world does not stay still. While this system refined its strengths, the world began to shift in ways that were not immediately obvious. Other economies began to diversify. Technology started to redefine value. New industries emerged that were not bound by the same rules of production. Speed began to matter more than precision. Innovation began to matter more than consistency. Adaptability began to matter more than control. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the environment that once rewarded this system began to change. But the system itself did not change at the same pace, because changing would have meant disrupting what already worked, and disrupting success feels irrational, even dangerous. So instead, the system did what it had always done. It optimized further, improved efficiency, refined processes, strengthened its existing model. But here lies the deeper paradox. The more perfect the system became, the less capable it was of becoming something else. It was no longer just a system that performed well. It was a system that depended on performing in a specific way, a machine designed for a specific environment. And as long as that environment remained stable, the system would thrive. But the moment it changed, the machine would not break. It would struggle because perfection in one context becomes limitation in another. And now the question begins to take shape, not as a loud realization, but as a quiet doubt. What happens when a system built for yesterday is forced to survive tomorrow? What happens when the rules change, but the structure remains the same? Because history does not just explain success, it reveals its hidden costs. And in this case, the cost of stability may have been adaptability. The cost of control may have been evolution. The cost of perfection may have been flexibility. And now, those costs are beginning to surface. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, in ways that are easy to ignore, until they are impossible to reverse. Because to see where the system is going, you have to understand what it depends on. You have to look beyond the ethnic surface, beyond the success, into the structure itself. Because to truly understand the flaw, you have to look inside the machine. 3. System mechanics word count. 1,000 words cinematic. Script. If you stand far enough away, the system still looks flawless. Numbers align. Institutions function. Output continues. From a distance, it feels like nothing has changed. But distance hides detail. And detail reveals truth, because systems like this are not understood from the outside. They must be taken apart by layer until the structure beneath the surface becomes visible. And when you begin that process, something unsettling emerges. The system is not as independent as it appears. It is dependent deeply. Deeply. Structurally, the first layer of that dependence is hidden in its greatest strength. Exports. This is not just an export-driven economy. It is an export-reliant one. Its growth does not originate. Internally, it is pulled from the outside. Demand from distant markets fuels production at home. For decades, this created an illusion of control. Factories produced goods, moved. Revenues flowed back. But the system was never controlling demand. It was responding to it. And response is not the same as resilience, because when demand exists, the system thrives. But when demand shifts, slows, redirects, disappears, the system has no immediate alternative. It cannot simply turn inward. It was never designed to. And here lies the first paradox. The more the system mastered global demand, the less it mastered independence. It became exceptionally good at serving the world, but not necessarily at sustaining itself without it. At first, this dependency felt like strength, global integration, market dominance, economic reach. But over time, it became something else. A vulnerability, because external demand is not stable. It evolves. Emerging economies rise. Consumption patterns shift. New competitors enter the system. And suddenly, the demand that once felt guaranteed becomes uncertain. Not gone but unpredictable, and unpredictability is something this system was never designed to handle easily. But exports are only the first layer. Beneath that lies something even more. Fundamental. Energy, not the kind that inspires speeches or headlines, but the kind that quietly powers everything. Factories do not run on strategy, they run on energy. Cheap, stable, consistent energy. For decades, this system benefited from exactly that. Energy was accessible, predictable, and most importantly, affordable. It allowed production to scale, costs to remain competitive, efficiency to remain intact. But energy is not just an input, it is a foundation. And when the foundation shifts, everything built on top begins to feel it. Prices rise, margins tighten, decisions become constrained. Suddenly, the system must operate under conditions it was never optimized for. And here's the second paradox. The system was built to maximize efficiency. But efficiency depends on stability. Remove stability. Efficiency becomes fragile because there is no buffer, no excess capacity, no room for disruption. Every process is optimized for a world where inputs are predictable. And when they are not, the system doesn't break immediately. It struggles quietly, persistently, but perhaps the most silent layer of all is one that unfolds over time. Demographics, not a sudden shock, not a visible crisis, but a gradual shift. A workforce that is aging, shrinking, slowing. Fewer young workers entering the system, more experienced workers leaving it. At first, the impact is minimal. Productivity remains stable. Output continues. But over time, something begins to change. Innovation slows. Adaptability weakens. Risk-taking declines. Because younger populations tend to experiment, older systems tend to preserve, and preservation, while valuable, does not create transformation. It maintains what already exists. And this system, more than anything, is built to maintain, to refine, to perfect, but not necessarily to reinvent. And here lies the third paradox. The system's greatest strength is its ability to sustain itself. But sustainability without renewal leads to stagnation. And stagnation, over time, becomes decline. Not dramatic, not immediate, but inevitable. When you step back and look at all three layers together, a pattern begins to form. Exports depend on external demand. Energy depends on external supply. Demographics depend on time. Three foundations, all outside direct control, all shifting. All uncertain. And yet, the system continues to operate as if they are stable, as if they can be relied upon indefinitely. But they can't, and that is where the illusion begins to crack, because the system appears strong precisely because it hides these dependencies. So, efficiency creates the illusion of control. Precision creates the illusion of stability. But beneath both lies fragility. And fragility, when combined with scale, becomes dangerous, because small disruptions no longer remain small. They cascade, they amplify, they interact with each other in ways that are difficult to predict and impossible to fully control. A shift in global demand affects exports. A disruption in energy supply affects production. A demographic decline affects innovation. Individually, each can be managed together. They create pressure. Pressure that builds slowly, almost invisibly, until it reaches a point where the system can no longer adjust without significant change. And change is exactly what this system resists, because it was not designed to change rapidly. It was designed to remain stable, and stability in a changing world becomes a constraint. So now, the question becomes unavoidable. If every part of the system depends on something external, what happens when those external forces begin to move in different directions? When demand becomes unpredictable, when energy becomes uncertain, when demographics become limiting, because systems like this do not collapse instantly. They adapt, they stretch, they absorb pressure, but they do so within limits, and once those limits are reached, adaptation is no longer enough. Something deeper must change, and that is where the real challenge begins, because this system does not exist in isolation. It never did. It is part of something much larger, something far more complex, something far more unpredictable. A global network where every connection creates both opportunity and risk. And to understand what happens next, you have to zoom out, because the machine you're looking at is not operating alone. Pull back far enough, and the illusion disappears. What once looked like a self-contained engine is revealed to be something else entirely, a node in a vast, intricate network. Threads stretching across continents, invisible lines connecting energy fields, shipping lanes, financial markets, and political decisions. This economy was never isolated, it was synchronized. For decades, everything moved in harmony. Raw materials entered from one direction. Energy flowed from another. Finished goods exited toward distant markets. Capital circled back, reinforcing the loop. Input, production, export, return. A perfect rhythm. Globalization did not just support this system, it completed it. It filled in the gaps, smoothed out inefficiencies, and amplified strengths. What could not be produced domestically was imported. What could not be consumed internally was exported. Every weakness found its counterbalance somewhere else in the world. It was not independence, it was alignment, and for a time that alignment felt permanent. Trade routes were stable. Alliances were predictable. Supply chains extended across oceans with almost surgical precision. Containers moved like clockwork, crossing borders without friction. Agreements held. Costs remained manageable. Energy remained accessible. It felt like a system that had finally solved complexity. But complexity, it is never solved. It is only temporarily stabilized. Because here lies the deeper paradox. The more connected a system becomes, the more it depends on things it cannot control. Every connection introduces a new variable. Every dependency creates a new point of failure. And when those variables begin to shift not individually, but simultaneously, the system does not break in one place. It strains everywhere. At first, the sea,